Alrighty, we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Wednesday. This is going to be the first live episode I've done by myself here on Wealth and Wisdom. I'm Tyler. I'm the head editor and creator of Wealth and Wisdom. I wasn't sure if I was actually going to do this, but after digging into it as much as I have, I realized I had no idea what was going on with the Maduro situation. And so I dug deep. And now, both to help supply the mission of this newsletter and this podcast, and to help cement it in my mind and let everyone else know what I've learned, we're going to be talking about the Maduro situation, what happened in Venezuela, the legality of it, all that. So let's jump into it. First off, everyone, before I move forward, I do want to remind everyone that this is not legal or financial advice. I am not a financial professional or a political analyst. These are my opinions. Before making any kind of decisions based on the information you read, please speak to a professional. Let's get started. All right. So, as I said, today's episode is about one of the most controversial and consequential moves by the United States in a long time. And it's the raid on the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro. This is a big deal. The U.S. forces launched a lightning operation last weekend with airstrikes in Caracas and used that as cover for a rapid extraction of a sitting head of state, regardless of whether or not he was elected legally or represented on the world stage. That's what this was. And more importantly, without a formal declaration of war. We had an instant reaction from markets when it happened. Oil jumped, energy stocks shot up higher at the idea of sudden access to the Venezuelan oil market, and gold and Bitcoin reacted as well. That didn't seem to last. If you look at markets today, they're just as frothy as they were before this happened, but it was a sudden spike. In fact, I remember seeing someone yesterday on X, I believe it was, saying that they just become a millionaire off of Caracas oil futures. It was a strange time. So, what happened here? That was the whole point of my research when I started digging into this. What happened? But specifically, it was focused on three big questions. Was it legal under international law, US law, and the Venezuelan law specifically? Second, how does this compare with other US actions? Because for people who've looked at US history, we might have noticed that we don't have the cleanest hands when it comes to this stuff. Just because we have a legal framework around which extrajudicial and extraterritorial disputes can happen doesn't necessarily mean we always follow it. And most importantly, what does it mean for you guys? The purpose of this podcast is always to make finance and economics as easy to understand as possible to empower you in your financial future. How is this going to affect you? Let's jump into it. So, what actually happened? We're going to walk through the timeline a little bit here. So, late in 2025 and then early in 2026 up to last weekend, the United States launched what's called Operation Absolute Resolve, a combination of airstrikes and special operation raids inside Venezuela. The operation targeted air defenses and key infrastructure around Caracas and then put U.S. Special Forces on the ground in the capital to seize President Nicolás Maduro and extract him to U.S. custody to stand trial. Within days, Maduro appeared in a New York courtroom facing narcotics and terrorism charges that the U.S. had already filed against him years ago under statutes that claim extraterritorial reach. We're going to talk about it in just a second. I'm going to put a pin in it just for that. In public, the Trump administration called this a judicial extraction mission, not a war, not an occupation, and not a full regime change invasion. There's also an ideological angle to this that's important to talk about. The White House has been talking about for some time about what some analysts are calling the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, a hardline version of the idea that the Western Hemisphere is a special U.S. sphere of influence and that Washington reserves the right to reorder politics in its neighborhood. In early statements around the raid, senior officials even suggested the U.S. might run the country temporarily until a political transition is in place. So that's the background here. We have a case of the U.S. coming in to extract a sitting leader that was then removed under the idea that the U.S. is allowed to maintain order in the Western Hemisphere. Basically, it's a little more nuanced than that. We're going to get to it, but that's the basic idea. This has caused a split reaction. There was a lot of applause from hawks and voters who saw Maduro as a narco-terrorist who finally got what he deserved. And one point I want to add here, there was also cheering in Caracas and in Venezuela as well from people who were glad to see Maduro go. But there was also immediate pushback from Congress. I was reading through the minutes from when this all took place, and it was nasty. You had people going against each other. There was one point, I don't remember the representative's name, but he had made the comment that the Democrats had done nothing to stop the problem of drugs and gangs in the Western Hemisphere and were basically telling President Trump he couldn't defend the United States. They were trying to limit him that much. And it got pretty nasty. It was basically the equivalent of calling the Democrats as sellouts and people who were not willing to support defense in this country. The main points of argument were constitutional and under the War Powers Resolution, arguing that no declaration of war was issued and no specific authorization of force was ever passed. This was a big deal. As far as we know, the U.S. president and the Department of Defense, Department of Intelligence, never mentioned this to Congress. In the press conference that happened, a couple days ago, the executive office said that this was because the Congress and Senate have a bad habit of leaking information to other countries, and they wanted to catch Maduro off guard. Who knows if that's actually why they did it, but that is the stated reason. Abroad, many U.S. allies have responded cautiously to this, emphasizing the criminal allegations, but not fully endorsing the legal theory behind a cross-border raid on a sitting head of state. A number of global South governments and legal scholars described it bluntly as a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and of the U.S. Charter's prohibition on the use of force. But as you might have noticed already, we're getting into a big issue here, mainly legal by whose rules. That's exactly what we're going to next. Let's start international, large scale. This is where the sharpest criticism was. People who have been watching on Twitter as this unfolds have also seen threats from UN Council members and chairmen saying that if this is allowed or if the U.S. makes any further aggression towards other areas of the world, that the UN will be disbanded, their bases will be taken over overseas. It's a whole bunch of threats flying everywhere. The basic rule of the post-1945 world is in Article 2-4 of the UN Charter, and it reads as this. States are not supposed to use force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state except in self-defense or wherein the UN Security Council authorizes it. There was no Security Council authorization here, and Venezuela did not attack the United States in any conventional sense. So the self-defense argument is at best a stretch. This is what is being thrown around on social media and in the news right now, is this idea that this was not allowed either by U.S. Congress or international law. But as you might have guessed, this gets a little hanky, to be honest. Normally, when one country wants a suspect from another country, the tool is extradition. This is a term that we've heard thrown around. I've mentioned it before to my friends who are all in on gold, saying, oh, we just need as much gold as possible. It's like, well, if you really want to protect your gold, it has to be in a physical vault in a bank in a country that doesn't extradite to the United States. Extradition in the global order is how we're supposed to move criminals from one country to another to stand trial. And that's happened over and over again. Edward Snowden, I think one of the former Middle Eastern dictators, there was an issue with extradition, so it's complicated. It's a treaty-based process, and that's why it's so complimented, handled through courts and diplomacy with the host country's consent. In the US case, they skipped this entirely. There was no public Venezuelan consent and no extradition process. Instead, it used airstrikes and special forces to take custody of a sitting president on his own soil. We're going to talk about the criticisms here in 1 second, so I'm going to jump to that. But I want you to focus on that idea right there, that this has no consent from the Venezuelan people, and it wasn't taken through the courts. So places like the Chatham House and other international law scholars call this a clear violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and the UN charters we talked about. Their argument is that it doesn't matter that the U.S. calls this law a law enforcement mission. If you cross a border with armed forces and remove a head of state, you've committed an unlawful use of force under the charter. They're also worried about precedent as well, and this is one concern I've seen on Twitter and something that I've thought about as well. If the U.S. can do a judicial extraction of a president it doesn't like, what's stopping Russia and China or any regional power from doing the same thing and claiming criminal jurisdiction over someone in another country? Let's talk about that for just a second. Again, I'm not a legal or geopolitical scholar by any means or an analyst in that space, but there have been a couple things I've noticed over the past couple of years as I've gone through my schooling and built out this newsletter. First off, rules like international law only work if people follow them. And the US is not the first one to violate international law or US law. We're actually going to be talking about that here in a second. And I want to focus on the China and Russia situation here first. What that idea is doing is comparing the US, which is a democratic, mostly, country that follows the global order. I actually got in a fight with someone on Twitter about this the other day when it first happened because I made the comment that the US has not been convicted of violating any international law, and he lost it. But it is true. We have not been convicted, and that's the important point here is under the global order, you're innocent until proven guilty. However, Russia and China don't really follow international law. That's the reason why they're in such hot water. Whether it's the Uyghurs or Putin getting rid of elections back in 2017, invading Ukraine, or now mailing package bombs to other countries. This system only works if everyone plays along. As we talked about before, this is treaty-based. It's voluntary. And the idea of Russia and China using this as an excuse to continue the war in Ukraine or to invade Taiwan, it kind of falls on deaf ears for me. China and Russia need no reason to go in and take these places aside from the authoritarian regime's choices. The Chinese Communist Party has already mentioned that they are planning to take Taiwan. They haven't done it yet, but they've been saying it for years. And I don't think this incident is going to change that in any meaningful way. Russia has been basically committed themselves to territorial expansion. Year over year, as I've been growing up, until today, Russia has continued to encroach on other people's territory under the same guise. Russian people protecting the Russian state. Again, I don't see this specific incident as changing that in any meaningful way. They may use it moving forward as an excuse to do things, but it's not going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's not going to trigger an invasion in Taiwan specifically for this, and it's not going to trigger a larger scale war in Europe for Russia, in my mind. But because I'm trying to be as objective as possible, we also have to look at the pro side, not just people who are criticizing it. On those in support of the raid, first there's a legitimacy bucket here. Many analysts and governments argue that Maduro had already lost democratic legitimacy The Venezuelan elections were not free and fair, and the regime functioned more like a criminal cartel than a legitimate government. If you buy that frame, you start to see the raid not as an attack on a sovereign equal, but an arrest of a criminal boss hiding behind the state trappings. This is something we're seeing happening in Haiti right now. And if you look back at their history, there's a lot of cases, not just in Haiti, but all over South America, where this is the case. You have a revolution from an imperialist or foreign, I hate the word imperialist, but I'm going to use it, a foreign tyrant. They have an election, maybe two, and then they're overthrown. The elections are either forcefully stopped, they're rigged, the constitution is changed. And this is what happened in the Maduro case. I think it may have even gone back as far as Chavez, but the point is here, there's a lot of scholars out there who do not see Maduro as a legitimate leader. In fact, it's the reason why the opposition leader had to flee to Europe. It was for the exact same reason. Is in Venezuela, opposition was crushed. Second, there's law enforcement and humanitarian buckets. We need to look at this as well. Supporters try to extend the logic used in counterterrorism and counter narcotics. The U.S. often claims extraterritorial jurisdiction where Americans, U.S. financial systems, and global drug flows are involved. And that has indicted Maduro for exactly these types of offenses. Maduro has an outstanding outstanding indictment from 2020 in New York courts on, I think it's 3 or 4 cases of narco-terrorism, trafficking cocaine, owning machine weapons, using machine weapons to traffic cocaine. It's a long list. That's what he's standing trial for right now. And in this case, if we use that extraterritorial jurisdiction logic, this does apply because not only are they doing this with the intent of trafficking drugs to other countries, they're doing it with the intent to traffic drugs into the United States, the largest group of consumers on the planet. Under that system, it makes logical sense why people would believe this way. And they even, like it says here, some also nod to the responsibility to protect style argument, pointing to humanitarian and criminal allegations, though that doctrine has never been accepted as a license for unilateral regime change. Now we're in a really interesting time after this has happened, where we're starting to see pictures coming out of Venezuela, and the picture does not look good. I wish I could show it here on these lives. I haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, but I saw a picture the other night of a person who owned a grocery store, a little bodega style store, with pictures before and after Maduro. Before, you see this picture of loaded shelves and a happy man. After, the shelves are barren with a few bottles, and the man looks like he's lost his soul. He looks sad and upset. I have personal friends here in the city of Utah where I live who had to flee Venezuela for the same reasons. The state came in armed and told them you cannot have your homes or businesses anymore. The way that the Chavez and the Maduro regimes have played out has created a humanitarian, economic, and democratic disaster in Venezuela. It's created a atmosphere of high inflation, large humanitarian crises, and just awful living conditions. The biggest voice I hear right now on Twitter specifically when it comes to this are Venezuelans upset and frustrated over what people are saying about how their country is. These people have lived lives of abject poverty, inflation, and loss of quality of life, and a whole bunch of ignorant Westerners are coming out saying that removing Maduro was a bad idea. As I've mentioned before here in my script, but also to you personally, this at the bare minimum was unethical according to the idea of international law. in my opinion. That doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do. That doesn't mean it was good or bad. Just from an ethical standpoint, I see this as unethical. But of course, that also raises an important philosophical question of whether or not it is worth it to let the people of Venezuela suffer for maybe more decades to overthrow Maduro themselves or have an outsider intervene. That's a tough philosophical question, and I'm not going to dive into it here. So, if we look at this objectively, we have a couple of different things that we can see. Under a strict UN Charter reading, the operation's unlawful. It's an unlawful use of force. If you expand it onto more of a failed state regime change narrative, the US is acting where multilateral institutions have failed. They're very different lenses around the same idea. When it comes to an investor standpoint, an economic standpoint, it's really doesn't matter about the moral argument here or what side you sit on, but it's important to recognize that this was a change in how we handle sovereign countries in the Americas. And it has massive implications for emerging market debt, emerging market stocks, and investing in other countries. It raises a really important question of where's the line? George Gammon mentioned that in his video on this the other day, saying, okay, we have one of the largest militaries on earth. There are very few countries who'd be able to stand against us. Where do we draw a line in the sand? Let's dive down a little bit deeper here, because this is where things get really messy, is the US side. The picture looks very different here, and it only gets more murky. On the criminal side, the case is straightforward from a US perspective. Maduro was indicted in US courts on drug trafficking and terrorism charges. You can actually go and find the court documents. They've been unsealed. Under statutes that explicitly claim extraterritorial reach, whenever there is a substantial US nexus. US courts have long accepted this idea. It's why in the past we've gone after El Chapo and other criminal and cartel leaders, because that is how the US runs its law in terms of drug trafficking. It's extraterritorial. They can go and get criminals from other countries to stand trial for these. The important thing here to notice is that the idea around when this is allowed is extraterritorial jurisdiction occurs if the conduct in question, if the crimes in question touch US territory, citizens, or the financial system. You could make the argument that drug trafficking does harm Americans. It definitely does. And that the Venezuelan president, if he is part of this, is responsible for that. There's also precedent for what people are calling an abduction of a sitting head of state. This is not the first time we've done this. In the Alvarez Machain case, I'm probably butchering that, the U.S. Supreme Court held that even a forcible abduction from another country does not automatically strip a U.S. court of jurisdiction unless the treaty explicitly forbids that method of collecting the defendant. The courts have essentially said if the defendant is in front of a judge, the prosecution can go forward. And that's what's happened here. There is legal precedent for going and taking another figure from another country and bringing them back to the U.S. to stand trial, even if by force. Critics see this as a massive escalation when it comes to a sitting head of state, but the doctrine's there. You can make the legal argument that this was allowed under U.S. law. The jurisdiction survives the manner of capture. That's the important thing. However, that's really not the angle that at least Congress is trying to take here. Congress is trying to take this not from a legal case, but from a war powers case. For people who don't know, and this is something I'm just learning about now, there is something called the War Powers Resolution that was passed in the 1970s to limit when and where and how the U.S. can go to war with other countries. At the time, it was probably a reasonable move. If you look at things like the Korea and Vietnam conflicts and the 20 years we spent in the Middle East, these wars get messy, they're long, and it destabilizes regions and economies for decades. However, just because we have it doesn't mean that it's actually used. Under the Constitution, Congress is the only one that has the power to declare war. Congress has been explicit that it did not declare war on Venezuela and it did not pass a specific authorization for the use of military force there either. What happened instead was a modern pattern. This is what we're getting to, right? Just because Congress doesn't actually pass the law doesn't mean it's not going to happen. The president, as commander in chief, orders a limited operation justified as necessary for national security and law enforcement. There's actually a quote I wanted to read here that is something that I noticed when I was doing my research on this. It was a political research piece called The Declaration of War, one for the history books by Major John L. Bacon of the U.S. Marine Corps back in 1991. And it's a quick quote here that I'm just going to read through really quickly. The declaration of war, while originally thought of as the preferred option in justifying the use of U.S. forces, in reality is a seldom used concept. Since 1798, the United States has involved its military forces in over 200 conflicts. Upon closer examination of those numerous conflicts, it's important to note that a formal declaration of war was issued in only 5 occasions. At the time, the Constitutional Convention, a formal declaration of war, was neither required by conventional international law nor practiced as customary international law. And this is important. That's the 1787 Constitutional Congress, realizing then that this idea of declaring war doesn't really mean a whole ton to leaders of countries. John Jay stated in the Federalist Papers that the founders were fully aware of the lack of power actually contained in the War Declaration Clause because hostilities were rarely preceded by formal declarations of war. I don't know if many of you have played the Civilization games before, but this is the way that I look at it. In that game, you have formal war. You can declare it, and that's how it happens on the global real life stage as well. However, more often than not, that doesn't occur. Since the passage of the War Powers Act in 1973, that's what we're talking about, both Congress and the president have violated its provisions in committing forces for the evacuation of Saigon, the Mayaguez recovery, I probably butchered that one as well, and the Iranian hostage rescue mission. The point here is, just because we have this rule doesn't mean it's actually what occurs in real life. And that doesn't make it okay, but it does give us a better view of what actually happens in the real world in these scenarios. It's never as easy as we're just going to have Congress take care of it. My suspicion is the reason why they get around that is because Congress is slow and inefficient. We actually want that as a country. That is not a criticism of the US government. We want an inefficient government. We want things to move slowly. We want there to be major brakes applied to any branch of government power. However, there are cases like the one that comes to mind is the Pearl Harbor scenario, which Major Bacon talks about in his paper. There wasn't really time to sit around and argue on the Senate floor. And so US leaders find other ways around it. If we go back here, in the War Powers Resolution in 1973, so that's what we were just talking about, was supposed to constrain this behavior by requiring the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of deployed armed forces and by limiting unauthorized hostilities to 60 days without congressional approval. In practice, both Congress and presidents have repeatedly stretched or ignored these requirements. We talked about a couple of examples of that already. We did have some pushback. Senators Tim Kaine and Rand Paul introduced a resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 90, trying to force the removal of U.S. forces from Venezuela and reassert congressional authority. Those efforts failed. It passed Congress, but it never made it through the Senate. And it tells you something very important here. Once the executive moves, Congress rarely has the political will to pull troops back in time. That leaves us with two narratives here of what that we have to decide from. If you're pro-raid, this is consistent with 70 years of practice. Congress has repeatedly ducked its responsibilities, and the president must act decisively against a narco terrorist regime that threatens U.S. national security. If you're against it, this is another step toward an imperial presidency, further erosion of congressional war powers, and a giant credibility problem when Washington criticizes others of violent sovereignty. That is one thing that critics have said a lot of on Twitter and other places specifically, is that because we've done this now, we can't turn around and wag our fingers and say nay nay at Russia or China if they decide to do this stuff. And I would agree. Does that mean we leave our allies to the winds and let them be conquered? No. But it does mean we've lost that moral ground by doing this. And I think that's a fair argument, regardless of where you look at. Regardless of what side you are on politically, objectively, I think that's a fair thing to say, is that we've changed the rules of the game. The way that I've described it to my friends is more and more in the modern world, instead of playing the rules of the game in the case of the international order that we all agreed to back following World War II, more and more countries are flipping the table instead. And like I said before, this isn't something that's all that abnormal. This isn't new in any sense. However, it is bigger than before. The US has been doing versions of this for a long time: raids, coups, covert operations, police actions, and regime change without formal declarations of war. However, on another level, grabbing a sitting leader on their own soil and flying them directly to the US courtroom is something that we haven't seen before. So, a really good example of this would be something like taking down bin Laden, taking down, what's the name? Soleimani is another example. We've done this before, but going after a president is something we haven't done in a long time. I know I've seen memes now of people pointing at Russia saying, "We did it to Venezuela. What makes you think that you're going to be able to stop us?" But we have to be very, very careful because of the fallout that can happen from cases like this. There's a couple of milestones there that show this as an example that this is something that's not new to us. 1980 Operation Eagle Claw, the U.S. sent special forces into Tehran to rescue American hostages without Iranian consent and without a UN mandate. This was a unilateral raid on sovereign territory, but the goal was to rescue citizens, not remove Iranian leadership. The second one was Just Cause, 1989 in Panama. The U.S. invaded and they removed General Noriega from power and did bring him to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. Washington cited the need to protect U.S. lives, uphold canal treaties, and combat narcotics as reasons. This is the closest analog we have to Maduro. Regime change plus criminal prosecution. When I was looking at this, they were saying that there were more troops, more casualties, and more occupation. In the case of Noriega, which from what I've heard, what I've seen is true. I don't know that for sure. But an important thing to point out here is that we've done this before in South America. Third, Saddam Hussein in 2003. The U.S. justified the invasion on disputed claims about weapons of mass destruction and on certain interpretations of UN resolutions. Saddam was captured, but he was tried in Iraqi courts and not flown to the United States. Same thing here, different framing, but a larger scale than what we did in Venezuela. And then finally, bin Laden, as we brought up, Pakistan, 2011. This was a unilateral kill capture mission without Pakistan's prior knowledge. It showed that the U.S. is willing to violate another country's sovereignty when it believes vital security interests are at stake. Bin Laden was not a state actor, though. He wasn't a sitting head of state, and there was no attempt to bring him to the U.S. for judicial process. Um, One thing I want to point out here, and I don't remember this exactly, but when I was growing up, I was under the impression that Pakistan wasn't really doing anything to defend bin Laden either. He was in their country, and as far as I remember, they weren't willing to extradite him, but they also weren't protecting him with Pakistani military forces. And so, this comment here that I wrote in my notes from the text that I had, violating another country's sovereignty, I think that one's up for debate. I'd have to talk to political experts to see if that was true. But I don't think that's the same thing that's happening here. In my case, from what I've seen from my research up to this point, is this is closer to a General Noriega situation where we are removing a dictator from power. And in that case, it never ends well. There have been many raids and strikes against ISIS and other high value targets as well. These normalized kill, capture, raid as a tool for foreign policy against non state actors operating under various authorizations and collective self defense arguments. So there's a pattern here. This is nothing new. The US, Democrat, Republican, red, blue, white, purple, doesn't matter. We've been doing this for a long time. And if you take an even broader perspective around central intelligence operations, this goes back as far as the 60s. Um, and again, we have two different arguments here. On the side that this is keeping with pattern, this follows a tradition of US use of force in other countries without formal declarations of war and pushing jurisdiction boundaries. For people who are against this, this is the first modern case where we used overt force to seize a sitting head of state on his own soil. Excuse me, and treat him primarily as a criminal defendant in the US federal court. Um, it makes this a possible break with past practice if you use an anti-raid argument. Let's get to the economic side of this now. We're running a little bit long and it's a little dry, but I think it's important to go through all this. If this becomes the new normal, you can expect other powers to do the same. Again, I don't see this as Russia and China doing this on a large scale. They're already in international hot water. And this incident, I don't believe, is going to change China's perspective of taking Taiwan in any way. If they're going to do it, they're going to do it. If they're not, they won't. And this won't change that fact. What it will change, which we're seeing already, is there is going to be a big legal battle and a big propaganda battle over this. China has already said that they're going to arrive with thousands of lawyers to call back debts that they had in Venezuela. In my opinion, that's a bad idea because when you start calling debts, other countries are going to do the same. It's kind of like we talk about with tariffs. When you add a tariff to somebody, the first reaction is to tariff you back. That's how we got into World War II with Japan, according to Dr. Sarah Payne. And I think that's a fair argument. If you start doing these aggressive actions, sure, this is already controversial, but if you turn around saying, well, we're going to call all our Belt and Road Initiative loans, one, you're making the assumption that they're going to agree to pay you, which is not necessarily a case that I believe. We've already seen other cases in Africa where people just laughed Chinese diplomats out of their country when they came to collect. And nothing about the current US presidency or government tells me that they're going to be interested in playing nice with China when it comes to loans made to Venezuela. Also, the US isn't, according to our leadership, isn't going to take over Venezuela. Venezuela is going to be running the government. So if you do that, you're just harming Venezuela. China's harming an ally, not necessarily the US. But you can expect other countries to do this. I could see a case where Pakistan, India, and other countries in the Middle East choose to do this. I don't see it happening so much in Europe, but I do see this happening in other parts of the world. I could see that as reasonable. And that's going to start to affect markets. If all of a sudden all chips are off the table and someone can come and arrest a president for whatever reason, it makes that emerging market become extremely more risky. Now let's get down to further level. Let's talk the money side. What markets actually did after the raid is really telling. Oil prices moved up and energy equities started to really rip right after this happened because traders price in immediate supply risk and the idea that Venezuelan oil is going to start flowing back into markets. For people who don't know, Venezuela's been under heavy sanctions for a while now. It hasn't legally been allowed to sell oil overseas. On top of that, this is heavy crude. It's infrastructure that the US is used to. It's something that we understand very well. And you have big players like Chevron who are already putting up billions of dollars to rebuild the infrastructure. That led to a rally. Gold and Bitcoin rose as well. That one's really interesting because those two rise for different reasons in my mind. Gold makes sense. Anytime there's a major shock, you're gonna see gold rise. It's a safety hedge. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is a risk asset. So what this tells us from this combination here is that people see this move, at least in the cryptocurrency world, as bullish for global economies and growth. One thing that is important here is that investors are seeing geopolitical risk but don't see a broader war. US equities in general started the first week of 2026 on a positive footing, and energy and defense leading while volatility stayed a little bit contained. Like I said, when I opened my Robinhood app this morning, markets have decided to throw that aside. And that was one thing that I was saying on Twitter the other day is, yeah, we're going to see an initial rise. I don't expect it to last very long because we've kind of got in the habit of ignoring these narrative stories unless there's some real meat behind it. If this had been a case where Chevron already had boots on the ground rebuilding a factory, we'd see a more substantial increase in oil stocks. But I don't think that's going to happen right now. At a sector level, there were obvious winners: U.S. oil companies and services with historic and potential claims in Venezuela, Chevron, Exxon, and others have done better. I think, if I remember right, ConocoPhillips struggled. And I believe so far, yeah. So over the past 5 days, they're about flat. And over the last day, they're down 3% when it comes to ConocoPhillips. They were up on the month. And if we look at Chevron, I'm guessing we'd see a similar story. Yeah, so if we look at today, they're down almost 2%. They were up almost 2 over the last 5 days as this all shook out. But we're starting to see that reversal come out. People are coming back to the ground. They're starting to see that nothing's really changed. If a new government in Venezuela recognizes these claims and starts to do business with US oil companies, we'd also start to see these stocks increase in value in a big way, in my opinion. Hi, Tetsi. I think that's how I'm pronouncing your name. Hopefully, I pronounced that correctly. Thanks for joining the live. If you have questions, add them below. I'll try to answer them. However, like with any market narrative, there are winners and losers, and there were definitely some big losers here. Regimes and corporations that rely heavily on the norms of non-intervention and the idea of holding assets through Western legal and financial systems protects them may see this as a wake-up call. This was an AI part of the script when I asked it to rewrite it for me and make it more human understandable. I don't really see this as the case. Looking at from what I've seen now, regimes and corporations that were relying on the Maduro regime and relying on the idea that status quo would be normal. Um, oh, well, I'm glad I pronounced it right. We are talking about the Maduro situation. So this will be coming out as an actual post here and on YouTube as well. So you can rewatch it later. We just went over all the legal mess that's going on in Venezuela. The basic idea, to kind of give you a breakdown of what happened, Tetsi, is the idea that was this illegal in some views? Yes, but in other views of both international and US law, there was a legal standard here, and it's part of a pattern we've been doing for 70 years. So that was basically all you missed. And now we're talking about how are markets going to respond to this? They've already responded a little bit. We saw a big rise in oil, like I said. And now we have to decide what's going to happen moving forward. I don't know when you joined Tetsi, but an important point that I made is gold and Bitcoin also rebounded because of what happened here, which is interesting because in my mind, gold and Bitcoin move for different reasons. Gold moves primarily because it's a hedge against risk, whether financial or geopolitical. Bitcoin moves Bitcoin behaves like a risky asset. It behaves like a speculative trade, in my experience, in my opinion. So what that says is that people looked at this as bullish for the crypto market for whatever reason. Increased oil, increased business in the US. Bitcoiners saw this as a bullish move moving forward. Okay. So when it comes to losers, I don't think in any case that this is a death of Western legal or financial system protections. I see this as a one off incident where the US government came in and did something that was definitely immoral, but is kind of in a legal gray area. I don't see that this is going to be a breakdown where the US is going to start claiming frozen assets from other people or anything like that. I know there's a lot of nerves around that right now because Russia's having that issue right now. On paper, it's why they're claiming that they're mailing package bombs to people, is because the European Union is considering selling their frozen bonds, their frozen euro bonds, to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction. And they see that as unlawful, which I think is a fair argument to make. I think they're going about it the wrong way. I don't see the US doing this with their countries. I don't see them freezing Greenland's assets or France's assets or Spain's for whatever reason. This is more isolated for me than that. This is targeting a authoritarian regime for oil or whatever reason have you. It's not a wider case of throwing the rule book to the wind. I can potentially see a lot of issues here with with companies that were doing business in Maduro's regime. So I see this as a big problem for Chinese markets for sure. They were buying Venezuelan oil, they were using it, and the rule book's definitely going to change here, especially if the US has any sway in how the next election in Venezuela goes and how that leader chooses to lead. It would be even worse for them if that leader tends to be US leaning instead of China leaning. It could change how they get access to oil, who gets it, and at what price. An important key point here, I think, as well, is Belt and Road. Um, the thing, and I talk about this later in my script, and AI brought it up to me as well. And people on Twitter have said this as well, of like, oh, well, what's China going to do now? People need to remember that the Belt and Road was largely a failure. It ended up that China spent a whole bunch of money on infrastructure in other countries that they are never going to get repayment for. Yes, there are some cases like the city in Singapore that was built by a Chinese land developer and no Singaporeans are allowed to live there, or there's airports in South America, Brazil, for example, where it's all staffed by Chinese who are sending the money home. So you do have that case going on, and other cases where China is calling resources and land in return for loans. But again, this is a case where China doesn't have a very big footing here. They're going up against a country that will probably align more with the US moving forward. They'll be under the US's protection, if you could say that. And I don't see them being very interested in playing nice with China. A lot of places around the world aren't right now. I know the EU is trying to walk back on that, but it wasn't too long ago where they were slapping massive tariffs on BYD, and you had countries like, I believe it was Norway, taking Chinese chip fabs as their own. So China's in a difficult position here. Russia was buying oil from Venezuela as well. Some of the tankers that were caught off of the Venezuelan coast were Russian ghost ships. So that's going to be a problem for them. I don't know off the top of my head how much oil they were getting from Venezuela. Russia's a big oil country, so they don't need as much, but their refineries are being hit. So it could take a hit for their forces and for their economic growth moving forward. But I don't know where that's going to go. It can't possibly be good. The best way that I can think of looking at this is best, average, and worst. So we have a best case, base case, and worst case here. Um, Best case here is a slow rebuild. In this situation, the US and a coalition of partners manage a negotiated political transition in Venezuela. Sanctions are eased in stages and production is slowly rebuilt. Foreign investment comes back in to rebuild oil infrastructure, and through a series of institutional changes, property rights, etc., Venezuela starts to take off again. This isn't going to happen overnight. One of the things that I learned a lot of when I was researching this is the Venezuelan government has hollowed out their infrastructure. So it's going to be years before this gets off the ground, in my opinion. What this means from a portfolio perspective is oil prices are going to keep dropping lower for a while. Then we already have an oversupply of oil in the markets. And if Venezuela starts to get production online quicker, it's only going to make that oversupply worse. It probably won't lead to a crash because, again, it's going to take years for this to get off the ground. But it is going to drive oil prices down. It's going to make a huge profit for certain oil companies, whoever decides to take that over, whether it's local companies or overseas. They're going to do better over the long run as this gets going. If this is a big if OPEC numbers are correct. That's one of the criticisms I've seen from other freelance analysts on Twitter is the idea that OPEC doesn't actually audit these numbers. They just take whatever number the leadership says and they throw it on their reports. So if this is a case, which we've seen in other regimes where the oil numbers are not as big, it's not as good as Venezuela says it is, then that's going to throw this whole thing out the window. We're going to get to that in a second. The last point I want to bring up here is it also, if we have this best case scenario where it's slow but productive growth, it's going to be a really big boon for emerging market debt and emerging market traders. You're going to see their stock market take off slowly. The debt's going to be more valuable in a reasonable, stable growth pattern. So you're going to have this overall, in this case, this overall increasing growth and benefit in the country, and people are going to make a lot of money. Okay. What is the next case? And I'm going to say this is base case because it's more likely. It's not necessarily good. The base case is things are going to continue as they are, but that doesn't really give us a whole ton to work with. In this case, pro-Maduro factions resist, the military breaks up, and the legitimacy of the new regime remains contested. So things don't go smoothly. You start to see regional bodies and great powers like China and Russia respond with more than rhetoric. This is one of the things that China's threatening is they're threatening calling their loans. I don't think Russia's going to get involved, but you get this idea of overall it starts to be chaos. Things don't move as smoothly as we want them to. This seems to be the pattern with intervention. It's happened in Haiti, other countries in South America, all over the world, where a global power intervenes and it doesn't go well. If this happens, the risk premium on oil stays higher for longer and emerging assets remain volatile. So that boom that I just talked about where emerging market traders make a ton of money and the country does really well, that's probably not going to happen in this case. And there's more pressures on global investors to think hard about overseas investment, especially in these smaller countries. I want to put a pin in that point just right there. Because this is not just, again, the AI readout was like, oh, well, this is going to be a problem for jurisdiction, authority, and sovereignty. For me, it would be more of a case of infrastructure and whether or not you're actually going to be able to keep your investments. This is one of the things that I wrote about in I think it was my second economic analysis in my undergrad, was people pull out of China back in, what was it, 2021? It wasn't because of COVID or it wasn't because of these other reasons. It's because they couldn't keep their money. They couldn't keep their returns if they kept their money there. China was putting on heavy capital controls. And we could see a situation here with that as well, where you don't get that smooth transition to strong property rights and the rule of law. And so all of a sudden, you could wake up one day as an international company who's invested money in Venezuela, and your company gets renationalized and you no longer own it. As a base case, that's, I think, going to stick around for a while. Is investors aren't going to move until they know for sure that they can keep their gains if they invest there. All right. Worst case scenario is our last one. Um, when I asked AI about this, they said it's low probability but high impact. In this world, the Maduro raid becomes a template. Other states start talking openly about cross-border anti-corruption and counterterrorism raids of their own. We see aggressive cross-border seizures, sanctions, and legal actions against foreign elites and companies. This is an eat the rich scenario. For investors, that would mean that structurally repricing of political risk and much sharper focus on where assets, entities, data, and key personnel are domiciled. I see this one a lot. Whenever I look at other countries, one of the things I hear a lot is people saying, "Oh, well, this and this could happen," and all of a sudden, all the rich companies and elites are going to be taken down. I don't think it happens as often as we say it does. Yeah, we've had some rare cases. China is a great example. Venezuela is another one where the elites, the 1%, were taken out and all their money fled with it. What I've seen more often as I've studied history is nationalization of these companies. So these elites go from being public or private company holders to lackeys to the party, lackeys to the bureaucracy, and they get to keep their stuff, but now they just have to follow more rules. Um, so I don't seeing this as being likely. Hypothetically, it's an option. You could have a case where people start going all out on just nabbing up other leaders. China could arrest and seize the Taiwanese president, for example. I don't see this as being something that's going to happen. More than likely, what would happen in this case is you have a lot of kleptocracy going on. You have a lot of seizures of assets. Overseas travel becomes a little bit more scary. And so you have to price that into insurance premiums and shipping times. Things get more expensive because we're breaking down that order of the US just polices everything and people can just move their ships around all over the place. The common threads here is something I've talked about before. It's legitimacy of the global order specifically, people being willing to play along, legal issues and how willing people are to follow international law and local law around these high controversial cases. And more importantly, the idea of, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. It's the idea that international treaties and international relationships are falling apart. I wrote about this before back in, what was it, May or March, where the AfD party was winning local elections in Germany, a party that's hard right. It's the first hard right party since the Nazis that was winning elections. And one of the things they ran on is making peace with Russia. We're starting to see that more and more. And for me, more than anything, the Venezuela situation is another case of that. We had our own reasons for doing it, but it was more of a case of a sitting populist leader, which Trump is, going, I actually don't care about the international law situation. I'm going to do this anyway. Because the more I learn about it, it seems like the international order doesn't actually help us as much as we say it does. There is one big benefit of it led to insane growth all the way through the 20th century. And Edom Blessing Gotti, thank you for joining. So that is something that I do see, where the international order has led to incredible economic growth the world over. We've brought people out of poverty faster than ever. Over the past 5 years, for sure, and maybe even as far back as 2008, though, that has crumbled. And it's crumbled because of situations we've talked about before with Brandon Byrne, excess debt, or here on the newsletter itself, where people aren't actually playing by the rules. They say they have free trade, but then they have all these little fun hiccups at port for various other reasons. It's people like the UK saying, well, we're into free trade, but we think there's too many chemicals in US beef, so you can't sell it here. Or it's someone like these smaller Middle Eastern countries saying, "Oh, well, we believe in free trade, but, this industry is really special to us, so this one's not free." The more I learn, the more I realize that this whole idea of the global order has not been as pretty as it appears on paper. We're only seeing it now because the free money era is over. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this is as we continue into the 21st century, we're going to see more of this happening. We're going to see more Irans. We're going to see more Maduro situations because people aren't willing to play nice anymore. And what does that mean for you as an investor and your wealth? That's the biggest takeaway here is after this situation, it's time to take an audit of where you are moving forward. Look at these scenarios and decide, where is my money safe? Am I willing to take the risks of putting money into emerging markets where laws and specifically property rights are not as neatly aligned as they are here in the US and the EU? Um, are you willing to put a little bit more money on the table for some of these industries that could take off in situations like this? Are you willing to maybe dabble in some oil stocks? Is that something that you're okay with and your risk appetite allows? None of this is financial advice, but I personally believe the best way to protect yourself in a situation like this is being willing to take that audit time and take stock of what you are willing to accept. I heard a really great acid test from an investor who's way more intelligent than me a while ago that said the best ROI is being able to sleep at night. And if your risk levels are keeping you up, you need to sell them because you can't handle them. And that's not saying that you're weak or unintelligent or anything like that. It's that your risk appetite is lower and that's okay. This also is following a new pattern that I'm seeing in markets where narratives are driving the price less and less. People are getting narrative withdrawals where they're tired of hearing, oh, look at what the US did and look at what this could mean. And what if, what if, what if? The what ifs aren't moving tickers as much as they used to. And so it is time to take stock and say, okay, have I looked at their balance sheet? Do I know how to read a balance sheet? Do I know what these statistics and metrics mean when I turn on CNN? Do I know what a PE means? Do I understand when they say free cash flow, what that means for a company, what it means for their investment moving forward? It's worth it now to learn more about that so you can better understand what your portfolio is doing. I'm not just saying that to plug the newsletter, but I truly think knowledge is power in this situation. And the more learning you have, the better equipped you're going to be. That's really all I have to say today is here we are. And unfortunately, it's not a nice ending. I was telling Alex Hickey on LinkedIn earlier today that the Maduro situation, it's very multi-causal. There's multiple different strings happening here, and I realize that us as human beings, we don't seem to like that. We like black and white binary scenarios, and the world rarely ever is. And this case is no different. I do want to close with these questions, answer them in the comments if you would like, because I think it would be kind of fun. Um, First off, do you see the Maduro raid as necessary realism for a world of criminal regimes, or as a dangerous precedent that will come back to bite the investors and citizens it claims to protect? So that's the first one. Was this necessary for you? Was it lawful? Was it ethical? Second, how are you positioning your capital, your career, and your life for a world where the global order is starting to shift a little bit? How are you preparing for situations like that? Those two questions. Answer them in the comments. Thank you guys for turning in today. Tetsi and Edom, thank you for joining in to watch. There was another person here, but I don't know who it is. I have four. So whoever that fourth person is, thank you for listening into the live today. You can always rewatch it here on Substack and on my YouTube channel as well. I'll list that in the comments so you can go read it, the link to this actual video. If you found this helpful and interesting, please do me a favor and share it with someone who may not understand this or is a little confused about what's happening in Venezuela, and hopefully it helps them. Thank you all and enjoy it. Have a wonderful rest of your week and talk to you guys later.